Jesus was still a man who was with him, who still got hungry, who still got tired, right? Who still wept. So they saw the humanness of Jesus. And so it's one thing to know. It's like, all right, let's take away Jesus for a moment. It's like one thing to know maybe your parents will die one day. Everybody knows that. But what happens when it gets closer to that day? Right? You know it's going to happen. It doesn't make it an easy reality to accept. And so when in John chapter 11, Jesus hears about the death of Lazarus. And there's so many cool things in this chapter that I can't go through all of it because it's just, I mean, it would be a whole series within itself in chapter 11. But there's some highlights I want us to talk about because I want us to identify really with the disciples here, right? And so Lazarus is dead, but where is he? He's near the head of where all the Pharisees are, right? The people who have are wanting to kill him. And Jesus has a decision to make. If I go, right, to heal Lazarus, I have to walk into all of that confrontation. And the disciples know as well. They say, please don't go, because if you go, they will kill you. And as we know from Peter, right, Peter doesn't want Jesus gone, does he? When they come to arrest Jesus, what does Peter do? Pulls out a knife, right, cuts off the ear of the soldier, right? Over my dead body, are they coming to take you? But I want us to just think about that for a moment. They're not trying to stop Jesus' will. They're not trying to stop Jesus from doing what he came to do. They are scared. And rightfully so. Rightfully so. They've had Jesus not just in the way that, you know, I got Jesus in my heart. Well, you know, but imagine having Jesus standing there next to you. Right? There's a peace and a security of having a person whom you've left your job, you left your career, you've left your family, you've been traveling and living with for the last 3+ years. And he's about to die. He's about to go somewhere where you know, and you got this feeling. And so we also have to struggle with that. Are there moments in your life and in your faith where you have felt like God is just distant? He's far from you. He's not there next to you, right? And so we get scared. We are afraid. You know, fear comes in. And so what we're going to be looking at this morning, one of the things I want us to really focus is on this idea of Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life, okay? We're going to hone in on that phrase. But I want us to turn to John 11, and we're going to start actually in verse, let's start in verse 17. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. That's an interesting theme, by the way, between Mary and Martha, of the one who goes to Jesus and the one who remains seated. But Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Think about that. Could Jesus have prevented Lazarus from even dying? Did he know Lazarus was going to die? Could he have been there before the death ever happened? He could have. We've witnessed it in Jesus' ministry already. People who are sick to the point of death, Jesus comes in and says, stand up and walk. And they do it. And yet Jesus tells us earlier to the disciples that this is done so that you may believe. Believe what? And that's what Jesus is about to have this conversation with Martha. Watch. So Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. She knew Jesus was the one who had the power, right, to raise Lazarus from the dead. Because whatever you ask, God will grant it. I've seen it. I know it. I believe it. Right? Now watch. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Now, that's a key point, because this is where I want us to kind of focus our mind. And I'm not trying to belittle any teachings that have been done in the past, none of that. But growing up, what I remember of preaching about the good life and the joys and the peace that God offers were always in the future, right? Life's hard now, life stinks now, but one day everything's going to be good. So you just kind of had to suffer and bear it, which there's a part of that in the Bible, right? Long suffering and, count it all joy when you go through various trials, okay? But there are hard times, and yet the Bible also promises peace in this life. Jesus says, I come to bring you peace, not the peace of the world, right? But a peace that surpasses understanding. I come to bring you a joy that is inexpressible, right? 1 Peter chapter 1. And so my question is, how do we obtain those things now? And this discussion is going to be pertinent to that, because all of us, and besides the Sadducees were ones who did not even believe in the resurrection, but the Pharisees and most of your synagogue and Jewish teachings believed that there would be a great resurrection one day. All right? That people who were the children of God, the people of God, would be raised in the last day. Now, what that looked like, how that happened, all varied within Jewish communities, but everybody believed that. And Martha, she grew up listening to those kinds of teachings, and so she knows, yes, one day Lazarus will be raised, obviously. But that's not what she's looking for. She's wanting Lazarus back now. Right? It's kind of like when people say, you lost a loved one, will you be able to see her one day? Well, I want to see her now again. I want her now, right? And that's kind of what Martha's going through. Bring her back, bring Lazarus back now. And so Jesus makes this statement, and I think it's powerful. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. First, he's using a present tense, isn't he? I am is also very significant in the book of John, of him identifying himself with the Father. Right? The I am statement made in Exodus chapter 3. But I'm not going to emphasize that this morning. Like I said, that'd be a great sermon, but that's not our sermon this morning. Point this morning is, I am the resurrection and the life, right here and right now. And Lazarus is going to be a demonstration, a physical demonstration of when Jesus brings resurrection to his people. It's not just the resurrection at the end of time. There is a resurrection that happens here, and it happens now. And so Jesus, to teach that and to prove that, he says, I'm going to raise Lazarus today. Not just in the resurrection, because Lazarus is going to have to die again, isn't he? And then he's still going to go through the second resurrection. Lazarus is going to have two bodily resurrections. Well, all of us will have two resurrections. Those who are in Christ, all of us have two resurrections, don't we? And so, I just want to finish off this discussion that they have. So I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And I was reading it this morning. There's one thing to read it, to put together a lesson in a sermon. And then there's other times where you get away from it for a little bit and you read it again. It just kind of hits you differently. When I read the do you believe this, it was like it was asking me, Jesse, do you believe this? Not Martha, Jesse. Do you believe that whoever believes in me will have life? Do you? Do you believe it? Do you believe it? And in anticipating the end of the sermon, kind of giving you a glimpse, you believe it by how you live it. Resurrection is a life that we live now. We live a resurrected life today. It's kind of exemplified in Ezekiel chapter 37, right? The valley of dry bones. Remember, God is promising in the future kingdom. God is promising in the Messianic age. And he tells him to go out and to look. Ezekiel looks out, right? And he's seeing this valley of dry bones, and it's been this great battle, and people are dead. And all of a sudden God says, but watch. I will give life to that which is dead. And the bones start, right, growing marrow, and, the joints start getting connected back together, and the flesh comes back together, and they're fully revived. And God says, this is what it will be like. I will breathe new life into you through the Spirit, right, and into your heart, and awaken you, and I'll bring you to life. And so let's go to Romans chapter 6 for a moment. Let's go to Romans chapter 6, and let's see how Paul emphasizes this. You see, in the first 5 chapters of Romans, Paul has been basically emphasizing that no matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile, a good Jew, a bad Jew, a good Gentile or a bad Gentile, or an in-between Jew or an in-between Gentile, right? He kind of takes every form, those who have gone, Romans 1, way off the deep end, right? Way off the deep end. Or if you're a Jew, right, who's even broken one aspect of the law, you're a pretty good guy, aren't you? Right? A Jew who would look at his life overall and go, I'm a pretty good guy. But have you broken the law? For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Right? All have sinned. And Jesus is that means by which God becomes just and the justifier. Right? And what does that mean? I love the picture of that. Because you go back to the garden. And what did God tell Adam and Eve? You eat of this fruit, and you will surely what? Die. What was Satan's version of that? You will surely not die. That was the great trick. That was the great deceit, right? Because death comes in more ways than just physical death. There is a spiritual death. There is a disconnecting from God. There is a being kicked out of the garden and being brought out of the presence of God. Life is represented of being with God. And so death, anything outside of God, even though it may have life, it's living death. Because when the inevitability of every person's demise happens, everybody will meet physical death. You are outside of God, that death is eternal. That death is eternal. That separation is eternal, right? And so what God has been working and scheming, right? We can use that word, scheming. We call it the scheme of redemption, right? The plan of redemption is that God would offer up His own Son. And He's got all these little stories throughout Old Testament to kind of represent that, to be kind of types and shadows of what Jesus would come and do. To ultimately, nobody could satisfy, right? Nobody could satisfy the death that was delivered in the garden. And yet Jesus comes in Romans 3, makes God just because Satan had the accusation against all mankind. They deserved death, and he was right up until the time Jesus came and died. And then Satan was wrong. And Revelation 12 actually brings that up. The moment when Satan was thrown down and the Son died and he went up to the heaven, he ascended, Satan no longer had accusation against those who are in Christ and those who were covered by the blood of the Lamb. Satan no longer has accusation against us. Right? And so, all right, that was a mini sermon in my sermon. All right, so Romans 6, or the end of Romans 5, is this idea